In just 1 hour, I set out to model, texture, and rig a low poly elephant. With a very simple process, I made the best render I could, but I gave myself a few restrictions along the way. First, I must have a completed product at the 5-minute mark, 30-minute mark, and 1 hour mark. I'm a huge advocate of finishing and shipping projects, and doing it this way gives me 3 projects in 1. Second, to give myself a bit of a challenge, I decided to texture it in the style of Chowder. With that in mind, it was off to the races. Instead of jumping straight into modeling this character, I spent the first 5 minutes doing a technique known as gray boxing. This is where you use gray, untextured boxes to block out the proportions of a scene. In the world of drawing and painting, people recommend breaking down characters and scenes into their basic shapes, and I like to do the exact same thing in 3D. It's important to do this because errors compound as you move throughout the modeling process, so it's crucial to get your proportions correct at the beginning. At the end of 5 minutes, I had a collection of cubes that approximated an elephant, and I was ready to move on to the next step. My goal for minute 30 was to get the final shape of the elephant defined so I could spend the last 30 minutes on texturing, rigging, and details. I started off, like all good Blender files do, with a cube. I took this cube and began adding detail to the mesh with a series of loop cuts, extrusions, scales, grabs, and rotates. I progressively added more and more loop cuts to give the model an even level of detail throughout the whole mesh. Only using loop cuts like this also guaranteed I had consistent quad topology throughout my entire model. After fiddling with the tusks, I had my 30-minute product. Technically, it was 30 minutes and 28 seconds. The last 30 minutes was divided into 2 parts, texturing and rigging. I mentioned at the beginning that one of my restrictions was to texture the elephant like Chowder. If you're not familiar with Chowder, one of the unique things about the art style is that many of the characters aren't colored with a solid color. Instead, it's a mask over a continuous background texture. Doing this in Blender is very easy. First, we find the texture we want to use. No, you'll do. Then we add it to a shader as an image texture and we make sure it's set to repeating. The final step is to add a texture coordinate set to camera, which gives us that Chowder movement effect. After this, I made a simple shader for the tusks, added an eye, and moved on to the rigging process. This process of rigging and weighting is one of my least favorite skills in 3D, but I do have 3 tips to make it easier for you. First, model your armature so it's symmetrical and just use the symmetrize armature setting to cut your workload in half. Next, when you're weight painting, on the top right, click on Options and turn on Auto Normalize. This ensures that every vertex's weight is set to 1, where it'll give or take the weight from the closest bone. Finally, use inverse kinematics as much as you can. IK rigs are incredibly easy to animate because with just a few controls, you can move your entire character around and it'll look pretty good. Time was running low, so I had to speed through the final step of the process. With only 5 minutes left, I had to pose and light this guy, so that's what I did. I went with a simple trumpeting pose for our elephant, and I slapped on a partly cloudy HDRI, which I got from Polyhaven. To sell that non-photorealistic effect, I had to add an outline, which I did very simply with the line art modifier. In the last 10 seconds, I was speeding throughout the entire model, trying to select edges like a madman to manually mark where my line should be, and finally, my model was done. And I do believe that I did accomplish the 2 restrictions that I set on myself. First, with the 3 completed products. Now along the way, I only did manage to make 1 finalized render, but each step of the process gave me a simple model that I would be able to use in another context. And on the Chowder front, you can't tell because it's a still image, but whenever you move this character around, it does have that moving background image texture coloring just like the characters in Chowder. If you have a 3D modeling challenge you want to see me try, go ahead and leave a comment down below, but otherwise, thank you for watching. Goodbye.